is John Sadi again from Decision Lens. I want to welcome everybody to the call this afternoon in late July. We're very excited to have everyone online and also a very senior expert level panel representing multiple of the services to give their perspective on readiness. The topic of the webinar is Readiness, Priorities, and Improvement, and we're going to be talking about that from multiple perspectives. The DoD defines readiness as the ability of the U.S. military forces to fight and meet the demands of the national military strategy. And just a comment, from a Decision Lens perspective, is that readiness is not a standalone concept. It needs to be put into the context of what it is you're trying to accomplish strategically, mission-wise, objectives-wise. And that really drives the need for priorities and strategy. We work at the very most strategic levels, a lot of organizations, and we see them struggling with how to take the concept of readiness and translate it into what they are trying to accomplish. And too many times without a framework or an approach that enables you to converge on priorities and strategy, you end up with what I call advocacy-based decision-making as the coin of the realm. And especially when you have limited resources and this much urgency about an issue or topic like readiness, you have to be very purposeful about what it is you're trying to do. You need to be able to crosswalk the investments that you're going to make back to the strategy and show how it's going to deliver a more advanced stance towards readiness. So the question is there only one challenge with readiness? Under sequestration level funding, the military cannot continue to operate at current levels and provide a fully ready, globally responsive force in the manner that the American people have grown to expect from their military. But the real question is, does more fix everything? More in terms of dollars, more in terms of people, and this is the topic that we're going to ask our panel to address. I'm going to hand it over to Dan Gossi, our Vice President of Business at Decision Lens, to introduce the panel and go through a series of questions.
Great. Thanks, John. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Really excited about the panel we have here today. Real thought leaders in this area. My role is to introduce the panel, and I'm also going to take you through some of the questions that we've received from the folks on the line and prior to the session regarding readiness. So as John mentioned, my name is Dan Gossi. I run our federal practice, and it's really my honor to introduce this incredible panel. I've had the opportunity to work with these great leaders for a while now, and when we broached the subject of readiness or holding this webcast on readiness to this panel, they all graciously agreed, as they each know the importance of readiness to our country and our defense. So it should be a great session. I'd love to read their entire bios, but that would probably take a full hour. They all have done quite an amazing amount of work over the last 20, 30 years. So with us today, we have on the screen, you'll see General Thurman. General Thurman's been a military leader for 37 years, and in his most recent assignment, he was the 4-star commander of our United Nations Command in U.S. Forces Korea. General Thurman's insight and situational awareness across the global spectrum is undeniable, so I really look forward to his perspectives here and abroad. So we'll look to get some good feedback from him and insights. Next, we have General Frazier. General Frazier's last assignment was commander of U.S. Transcom. And prior to that, he was the commander of ACC, which is the largest major command in the Air Force. He's managed and led hundreds of thousands of folks, so he's well versed in terms of making sure that large organizations are ready for the fight. His situational awareness is global, and he'll be able to share some of those perspectives as well. And then, in addition to General Frazier, we have Admiral Dunaway. He actually happens to be sitting right next to me. I think he probably came in personally to hit me if I've asked him any tough questions, but I've known Decoy for a number of years. He's one of the smartest people I've ever worked with, but the great thing about Decoy is he can take incredibly complex concepts and explain them in real simple to share terms for people like myself that need it in layman's terms. So it's just an honor to have him here as well. So we're really privileged as a company to have these great leaders on board with us today to handle the questions, and they're really, truly subject matter experts. And I don't want to mention how many years they've served, but combined, they're over 100 years of military leadership and expertise. So there's something to be said for that amount of time and experience. So with that, why don't we get rolling? So question number one, that came in. Readiness is built in many constructs, from manning, equipping, training. How does one best evaluate where resources should be applied to maximize readiness and force effectiveness? I'm going to throw that over to General Thurman first, and then if you want, sir, you can maybe, we'll get a Navy perspective from Decoy as well. So, sir, over to you on that question. And if you need me to repeat any of the questions, please don't hesitate for me to ask.
No, how do you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay. Well, first off, we could spend the whole session on readiness and probably more time after that. For the United States Army, they measure readiness, obviously, through about 4 levels. Is what we measure readiness that's recorded monthly. Over the last 17 years, we've been focused on counterinsurgency, other than the first part of Operation Iraqi Freedom, which we did do large-scale combat operations. And I think what's important today, with where we find ourselves, is we've been spending all our time on counterinsurgency operations and not focused on the high-end level of combat operations. With the recent national defense or national security strategy and what General Mattis and General Dunsford has done to refocus, it's clear to us we got to get back to being able to fight a near-peer competitor. Read Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, is what we need to be focused on. So the Army measures readiness from a people standpoint up front. People is very expensive. During sequester, we started drawing the Army down. We have stopped the drawdown of the regular Army, the Army National Guard, and the Army Reserve. The Army is trying to get back above 500,000 for the regular Army, above 350,000 for the National Guard, and 209,000 for the U.S. Army Reserve. We're setting for the regular Army about 476 today, give or take, and the Army Guard is setting down around 345, somewhere around that. Guard or the Army Reserve around 195. I bring out the people because people is important. 10,000 soldiers will cost you about $1.4 billion, or a little more than that today. That's what it costs when you start trying to put a price tag out there. It's probably higher than that. So this is big money when you start talking about people, and it takes a while to recruit that force. What the Chief's trying to do right now is recruit between 4,000 and 5,000. I think recruiting is going to be a problem for the all-volunteer force. The manning guidance right now that the Army's trying to do is not grow any more units, but fill the holes in the units. Typically, we want to get them up to about 105% strength. A lot of these units go out the door less than 90% today because they don't have the sufficient manpower and they fall out. So the priority right now is filling the operational force. And you can dissect this whole people business quite a bit. The other thing is we've got to put more green suiters on the platforms in the schoolhouses. That had atrophied back due to the demand on the force to for going to contractors, etc. That's expensive. And then they want to increase the observer controller trainers at our combat training centers and reduce headquarters and staffs. So for what Decision Lens provides to try to put some of this in perspective and get the right context of it, there are some opportunities in there on how Army prioritizes the people readiness and how they account for certain things. The Army's also subsequently building 6 security forces assistance brigades. 5 will be in the regular Army, and 1 will be in the Guard. 1's deployed to Afghanistan right now, and the whole purpose of those is these are train, advise, and assist units. These are cadres, units built around a brigade combat team that will go assist in training, because we typically break units apart to go get them ready to go train, advise, and assist. The next piece I will talk about is equipping. the amount of equipment that goes in a formation. Obviously, there are C ratings associated with equipment feel and S ratings for sustainment. Now, just to let you know how bad the situation got there, we were not using tanks a lot, so there was no demand on the supply system for tanks, M1 tanks, and so there's parts availability problems. Some of the small businesses that provide parts went out of business, and so there's been a problem on readiness and maintenance of the armor fleet. The other piece of readiness is with training and training levels. We were not training high-end training, and that's for decisive combat operations against near-peer competitors. We have since changed that and have started back doing that at our combat training centers, primarily Fort Irwin, California, and Fort Polk, Louisiana. So we're trying to increase the training levels, but sustainment is built in that, and where the resources come in is, one, it's called time to train, where when you've got units that are not completely full, units that are being tasked out, obviously that has a high demand on their training levels. The Army is also changing its construct on readiness, and that's to get where you've got folks that are more readier all the time than what we were doing on a fourth generation model, because we were doing a fourth generation model for Iraq or Afghanistan just to sustain that. So those are the big things that's changed in that. We'll talk more about this here in a minute, but the whole intent of the Army right now today, General Milley believes in 24 to 30 months from now, he can have 66% of the Army ready at a C1 level, C2 level, with the force being ready to meet near-peer competitors by 2028. But when we go through sequester and get all these cuts, it's had a very large impact on the United States Army, I can tell you that. And I'll pause right here and see if I shot over the target or behind the target. Over.
No, I think you shot right on the target with some good examples there, sir. Appreciate that. Great perspectives. Why don't we round out this question with a Navy perspective from Vice Admiral Dunaway. Decoy, you want to share anything on this?
Sure. So the Navy runs a tiered readiness model because of our deployment on ships and carriers. And so as the carrier cycles go through, basically post-deployment, we take squadrons down to a very low level of C rating, which is the capability rating. And we take their assets away, we go to deep maintenance, and we start to build ourselves up through C4, 3, 2, 1, so that we're C1, 2 as we deploy on our 7-month deployments with the carrier strike groups. So to get there, basically you're balancing through the OMAN accounts, the ops and maintenance accounts for the Navy. And in those accounts, you've got 1A, 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 2A, 1A, 3A, and these accounts basically represent different elements of the readiness equation that the good general was talking about. You have a flying hour account, you have a spares account, you have a training account, you have maintainers and personnel. And so all of those elements have to build up to produce two things: ready aircraft and ready pilots. And getting to ready aircraft and ready pilots is a pretty complicated job of, on the aircraft side, having an airplane that's designed well so that it doesn't fail, so that you know what's going to fail and you have the proper parts, so that when a part fails, a maintainer can take it out and replace it, and that you can ship that part off, get it fixed, and get it back, and that you have enough on the shelf to keep the flight rates that you're going to predict to fly. From the pilot perspective, you have to train them on all the mission areas, and then you have to keep them proficient over time. And that's a complicated equation that very unfortunately gets put into individual bins where people only want to talk about spare parts, they only want to talk about people, they only want to talk about how many airplanes you have, they only want to talk about how many hours you're going to fly, when the truth of the matter is that all of it has to be harmonized. And if you're going to have less money than you need to execute your missions, it's even more important to harmonize those accounts so that you're not putting too much in flying hour and not enough in spares and ending up into the readiness holes that we're in today. And I think the use of something like decision lens in these complicated problems so that warfighters can actually see the interrelations between the accounts, figure out which accounts are efficient and not efficient, attack the inefficiencies in those accounts, and then rebalance them on the fly, is the way that you optimize the use of the taxpayer's dollar in order to create the perfect amount of ready airplanes with the perfect amount of proficient pilots to optimize every buck that you get into those accounts. We do a very poor job of that optimization in the spending, budgeting, and allocating process. We do a heck of a job responding to the mismatches through miraculous Herculean human efforts in the end game. And it's just a shame because what that equates to is inefficient use of limited taxpayer resource.
That's great. Great examples as well. Thank you, sirs. All right, General Fraser, ready for a double whammy here? We might go 2 questions for you. We got 2 in here. The second one clearly is from someone in the Air Force, but let me start with a higher level question to start. Given the current geopolitical conditions, what are the strategic imperatives of our military that our military must consider to be ready? And any thoughts on how they might prioritize these? Over to you, sir. Okay.
Will, you're on mute if you're talking.
He is running for a flight, we know that, but hopefully he's not in the security line right now. So, Decoy, since you're here, any interest in covering current geopolitical conditions and any strategic imperatives that really?
So I think General Thurman hit on it pretty well. You know, we've been years of running into Iraq and Afghanistan. That's a completely different game than a near-peer competitor and a high-end fight. We also went through the sequestration timeline where we were really living hand-to-mouth, and in the case of the Navy, we consumed every bit of buffer that we had into our system and really got ourselves on the edge of being able to deploy a lot of assets because we had consumed the buffers that we had in order to make the readiness commitments that we had. So now we've really got to do something different if we're going to handle these near-peer competitors and optimize the use of these assets that we have in this new geopolitical situation that we're dealing with.
I appreciate that. Thank you for covering that. We had something else pop up here. So if anyone's having any issues logging into the Adobe Connect, you can go ahead and send your questions to info@decisionlens.com. Again, info@decisionlens.com. Okay, thanks. I think General Fraser is probably still tied up. I did get a text from him that he's in the TSA line, so you have some bad weather here in D.C., so his flights got shifted around a little bit. He had to go on an earlier flight. So let's do this. I'm going to switch. We'll come back to General Fraser, and we're going to go to you, General Thurman, real quick. And this is actually an Army question that came in, so bear with me. It's kind of a long one here. As the Army looks to accelerate the speed of acquisition, most notably by establishing an entire new four-star command focus on closing the gaps between requirements, science, and technology, and fielding, what is being done to address sustainment, logistics, and the total ownership aspect of next-generation weapon systems? That's a tough one, I know, but it came in from one of our Army commands here in the U.S.
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah.
Well, first off, the Army has not done a good job of defining requirements well for combat systems. I unfortunately was on the scene for killing the Comanche. I'm the guy that made the recommendation to kill the Comanche because our aviation was in bad shape as we came out of the first phase of the Iraq War. And I was told to to go do a study, top-to-bottom review, and figure out where we're putting resources. And long story short, we took what the Army was going to purchase, 121 Comanches, a $14.5 billion program, and we were able to keep that money and apply it back and fix aviation. If we hadn't have done that, we would have probably been in sad shape. But we typically fail because we're not able to get requirements identified. And the DoD 5000 acquisition process is very cumbersome. And typically our processes get truncated by the threat. The threat changes and we're building the wrong stuff. So what the Army's trying to do right now, and this is to get back at the readiness piece and have the Army ready by 2028 to reestablish dominance across all domains, is the chief has came up with looking at key priorities to support COCOM. The first being long-range fires and modernize our artillery. We had allowed that to atrophy. So that's the priorities going to rocket artillery and SHORAD as an example. We had one air defense battalion left in the Army force structure. And it was in the Army National Guard. Oh, by the way, it was guarding the National Capital Region. So that's priority one. Priority two is, and this is all built around move, shoot, and communicate. Priority two is move to the next generation combat vehicle. For a Korea war fight, obviously the bridges over are too small to take a 72-ton tank. That's why we had to have a lot of bridging. But so as an example, replacing the Bradley fighting vehicle. So getting the best technology, getting the best prototyping available is what we're trying to do here with this Futures Command. Third priority is future vertical lift, and that's a new modern airframes, i.e. And there's 5 capability sets in those, but primarily it's with a future attack reconnaissance platform and a future assault platform, which is CAPESAT 3. The other thing is to communicate, and that's built around a network, the redesign of the network, and positioning, navigation, and timing to protect the networks that are out there. We're heavily relying on GPS as an example. So the whole point about this is being able to operate in a denied environment, protect against enemy fixed wing, rotary wing, and unmanned systems, and then lethality. I lay these out because it's important to understand where the Army wants to go. As it sees the future battlefield, working with COCOMs and supporting COCOMs, it's multi-domain operations. We're not going to go at something alone. Now, so the Army has created a Futures Command. It's going to be stood up in Austin, Texas. About a 500-man headquarters, mainly to coordinate the cross-functional teams that are aligned with each one of these priorities. So what does it consist of? It consists of a Futures and Concepts organization. The Army took the Army capabilities and requirements out of Training and Doctrine Command, and it's sliding under that. Combat developments from the Army Centers of Excellence, aviation, infantry, armor, signal, field artillery, and they put a line to combat developments under that, and then combat systems were the 10 program executive offices fit under that are under the acquisition command. They will stay aligned with acquisition. And then the whole intent of this is to be able to integrate requirements, acquisition, and sustainment. give you an example because I'm very familiar with it, is this capability set 3 for future vertical lift. Because I helped one of the outfits that's building one of the prototype or demonstrators. They're building that off of iPad. So what you're going to see in sustainment is more predictive maintenance in order to get to preventive, to keep more of a offensive preventive type situation. So you can forecast parts, 3D design using the latest technology. So the Army's trying to get at that through these means of using the best technology available, the best manufacturing techniques, one with the whole notion of cutting cost. Cost is a big driver in this, as we well know, because we have a tendency to let procurement of systems get out of control. So that's what the Army's trying to do to change how it does business with creating this futures command, and sustainment is nested and fully integrated in this as they go forward. So, we'll have to see how this all turns out. They're in the throes of standing all this up right now, so stand by. Over.
Roger, sir. Thank you. Again, awesome examples. These are really what people like to hear about, so thank you so much. All right, we're going to go back to Decoy because I think we're still waiting for General Frazier. So Decoy, we have another question. It's a little bit overarching, but let's throw it out to you here. Well, what examples can you share for our listeners to put into action so their organizations are more likely to assess the readiness and pivot where necessary to improve readiness?
Yeah,
so examples.
So I'll go a little old school. War is really economics by other means. Some smart guy said that. I forget his name. Maybe it was Clausewitz. If you don't behave differently, given the money situation that we're in now, I think we're going out of business. And by that I mean we are not going to be the dominant force in the world that we need to protect our liberties, way of life, economic freedoms, trade, commerce, the things that are important to this country. And I don't say that to be alarmist. I say it because I'm burdened with the ability to do math. And I've been through the budget my entire adult life. I see less and less asset coming for more and more money, with plenty of adversaries around the world for us to go after, and they're in hard places. And so I believe that we've got to start getting more and more out of the dollars that we're spending. Now, to be fair, the DoD 5000 is this amorphous blob of enemy that impacts industry negatively. It impacts the Pentagon negatively. It impacts the warfighter negatively. It makes it nearly impossible to get to those levels of efficiency that I'm talking about. And having spent a better part of my adult life trying to navigate through that system, I have seen areas where we have, in fact, navigated through the DoD 5000, which actually, if you read it, allows you to do a number of things. It's the individuals and the cultures of the system that prevent you. And what I have seen is that there are people who are fed up with the bureaucracy sub-optimizing the few dollars that they have, and those people emerge as leaders and figure out a way to navigate a path through all of the no's that prevent the effective use of funds. And so what I would suggest is that we've got to get more and more people fed up. We've got to, with a tenacious zest, navigate through this system with data, thought, with clear examples. We can't accept the stupid inefficiencies that we've had to deal with in the past. We really have to get individual leaders to sponsor smart efforts and be tenacious enough to navigate it through the system. I hear it all the time through our leadership, how willing they are to take those risks. And then I watch the system very painfully squash every one of them before they get to the head of the line so that somebody can make it work out. Now, that being said, there have been some great shining examples of how we've cut corners in the system. We talk about network warfare. I am absolutely positive that technically we can solve that problem. It's organizationally that we suffer. And for that, I think you need to be very articulate. You need to be very systematic. You need to be robust in your decision process. You need to show all the reasons why. And then you need to be a tenacious fighter to get it through the myriad no's that always show up when you approach a bureaucracy.
That's great. Fantastic. Great. Thank you, Decoy. Good insights as well. So this is kind of an open-ended question, but in this, I'll lob it up there for either of you to take. Do you all think that we're behind the curve or ahead of the curve on readiness as we stand today as a U.S. defense?
Well, let me jump in here on that. When I left Korea, well, first off, when I went to Korea, I was surprised to see us in the shape we were in over there, candidly. And the shortages of munitions, precision munitions, and the number of single points of failure that we have in our infrastructure for the industrial base. You know, Patriot missiles are made in one place in the United States. That's Camden, Arkansas. And so I started looking at that, and I didn't realize that, you know, that, hey, if we go to war over here tonight, and we're supposed to be fight tonight, we were in pretty sad shape. Subsequently, they have built that up. One of the things in the processes that I have seen, and I'll just use being a sub-unified command, of course, that Korea is a real complicated place over there because there's I wore three hats over there. But I never saw money move inside the Pentagon based on the Joint Integrated Priority List that combatant commands turn in. Admiral Sam Locklear and I worked very close together. He was PACOM commander then. And we would list things in priority on resources, and I never saw much money move because that's over with the services. And I think something's got to change with how we do business, because I went through the sequester when we were doing that, and that was more or less a salami slice is what I was seeing, based off of flawed assumptions is what I saw occurring. And so I think right now, to your question on readiness, I think we're trying to catch up. But we're you go into a European theater over there, I think we're going to be challenged to get in there just by our ability to move, large-scale units, and our ability to get this manufacturing capacity going for PGMs, et cetera. I mean, that's just my sense, and I think we're handcuffed by the bureaucracy of the Pentagon to a large extent, and it's going to close on us again. This, you know, I just looked at this budget that's going forward, a $676 billion budget coming out of the Senate Appropriations Committee for Defense. I don't think we're going to continue to enjoy these, because I'm with Decoy. We better figure out how to prioritize and get the most out of these bucks that we're getting, because I think we get plenty of money, but I'm not sure we put it in the right bins. Over.
Yes, sir. I agree completely. I would think you'd be able to run a military on $680 billion. But and for the Navy, from the naval perspective, ships and aircraft, we are in a hole. There's no doubt about it. And we have consumed our buffer. The way aviation works is you buy war reserve airplanes, you keep them in your training facilities, you have non-deployed squadrons that create buffer, and you keep that level of capability so that you can surge and so that you can suffer war attrition losses. Since we were not surging, we had these steady deployments. Since we were not suffering losses, we consumed all of our, at least in naval aviation, we consumed all of our buffer meeting normal deployments because we were funding the machine at 80% for 10 years. And when you do that, you end up, eating hand to mouth. You're on the edge. And now, the good news, I would say, on that kind of a problem is it really makes you think about making yourself more efficient and effective when you go through it. The key, like both General Thurman and I have said, is there's got to be very intellectually and robustly based decisions that are shepherded and sponsored by hard military officers who do not take no for an answer and are willing to navigate the system. I can't tell you how many times I've knocked on a door in the bureaucracy, and before I even open the door, the answer is no. And then a lot of people turn around and walk away from that. To me, that's when the negotiation should begin.
That is so well said. Well, that's great. Thank you, guys. I still think General Fraser's still tied up, but we have another question that just came in through the chat window here, and it talks about how do you measure the impact of surge operations, example, disaster response, on the ability to achieve readiness. So I think the question is trying to get at, we have a lot of threats right now. We have a lot of changing initiatives, so, especially the Navy, obviously, with South China Sea and all the things that are happening there. We have Iran, we have Russia, we have North Korea. We have so many things coming at us. Where do we focus our attention? How do we focus our attention? And I think, General Thurman, you pointed this out. There's a lot coming out of the Pentagon, but there's also a lot of things happening at the command level that are more tactically focused. So how do we balance all of that, right? How do we look at the whole picture globally, and then how do we distill it down to the metrics at the command level to really, hit the short and long-term goals we need to stay ahead of the curve for readiness? Any other thoughts? I know we've covered a lot of this ground already, but any other additional thoughts?
Well, from the Army perspective, I used to have, in my past jobs I had, I was the G3 of the Army for 3 years. So managing surge, I did. I was there when we had Iraq surge. I was there from 2007, 2010 in the Pentagon at G357, and then I went to Army Forces Command. That was my first 4-star assignment as we were running force generation for the Army. We try to prioritize inside of forces available, but we were trying to feed Iraq, Afghanistan. The number one priority, which is in our national security strategy, is the defense of the homeland. I mean, so if you got something that happens domestically, you're going to go after forces that may be training for Iraq or Afghanistan. That's why we have heavy reliance on the Army National Guard in the States. So having them ready to balance out what the Army National Guard needs out there is very critical to what we do. But we use all the Army now. We don't just use regular Army because of the demand on the Army. Over the past few years, we found ourselves consuming readiness as fast as we build it. And so being ready for what? I used to get asked that all the time. What are you ready for? Well, it depends on where you're at. But as an example, when I was a division commander down here at Fort Hood, Texas, and I was getting ready to take my division back into Iraq, as it had just redeployed, trained it back up, reorganized it, re-equipped it. The hurricane came up down in New Orleans, and I was sending my helicopters down there to support that. And so how you manage bank time on those aircraft and the demand and maintenance to have sufficient bank time on those platforms when you're deploying them into combat, but they're needed here in the homeland. So those are some of the trade-offs that we get into here trying to balance all that. But
Roger.
But what I would just tell you, we've got to find a smarter way of managing these training dollars. The other thing, when you look at the total obligation authority to the Army, it's going to be between 12 and 13% of the budget is what goes to training. If you go back through history and look at that, it never changed. It's really interesting to watch where the money's going. So that's where and working with Ted, trying to point him to some of these key directorates up there in the Pentagon that can help them, because they got to figure out a smarter way to do business than the way we do things, particularly when the cut comes in on a Friday night, that you've been told to offer up money. And I just think we're going to head back in this. I don't think we're going to get ahead on readiness, first off, because I'm watching what the budgets are doing, and I think we've enjoyed a couple good years of the budget, and I think it's going. Sequester hadn't ended. That budget is going to go back down or just flatline again. That's what I believe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have one more question.
Yeah, so this is John Sassati. One of the questions that I had is, from you guys' perspective, is readiness a absolute concept, or we have a certain target that we've developed around readiness and how we close the gap to that target, or is it a moving target based on the relative competencies of the other actors in other theaters that we need to, that we need to be able to address? I mean, do we need to keep up with them and what their readiness is and be better than that, or do we have an absolute concept of readiness regardless of what they're capable of? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I'll chime in from the Navy's perspective. We actually have a little bit of both of those. One, we do a tiered readiness model like I mentioned earlier. When you come off deployment, there's no reason to really keep everybody running hard all the time. So we save a lot of our readiness pursuit dollars, and we can do deep maintenance on ships and deep maintenance on airplanes and get that done. That's a good thing to add that into the mix, to keep a complicated, technically oriented, machine-oriented service like the Navy up and running. When we deploy, from a naval perspective, we don't know where we're going. Now, yeah, we got a plan. I mean, the plan might be to go to the Persian Gulf, but I can't tell you how many times I've been on deployment and they said turn right, and you go this way, and you have a complete different adversary. And so you have to be prepared on the fly to make those kinds of things happen. That requires, and especially nowadays, when you look at the fighter mix on the carrier, the F-18 basically does every mission in the inventory in a single seat, sometimes two-seat airplane. So that pilot has to be proficient in a 4v4 counter-air mission, or a close air support mission, or an ASUW mission, or a sea surface search mission. He has to be proficient in all of those. And so that drives how you produce readiness for people, and it drives how you sustain the system that gets them parts. The last thing I'll tell you on that model is that in the free market, when you're generating readiness with airplanes, if you go to American Airlines, the notion that you would have 12 airplanes on a flight line and be happy to keep only 8 of them up and ready to fly, keeping 4 of them in the maintenance hangars doing maintenance, would make you bankrupt. American Airlines enjoys 90-something, 98% availabilities on their airplanes because that's how they make money. There is no real hard consequence right now on having airplanes sitting in a hangar bay waiting apart, and it's a shame, because if we could suffer that consequence, I think it would drive a behavior to keep parts on the shelf. You know, that's really a huge sub-optimization of a tens of $million asset sitting in a hangar bay waiting for a $100,000 part. That's a huge sub-optimization of asset. So those are the kind of things that I would bring into the equation as we're generating force and readiness.
Great. Anything you want to add on that, General Thurman?
Well, I would just say we're a little bit different than the Navy, obviously. Our formations the operational force is built around brigade combat teams, and we can put them under any division we have. In our brigade combat teams, there's a lot of high-demand formations. As an example, armor. We have 9 armor brigades. All of those are committed. And we're having to use the 5 or 6 that's in the Guard because one of them's being converted. That's the demand on the force out there just for heavy armor. Because we drew that force down, so now we've created a problem for ourselves, readiness. Because if you're deploying brigades, it takes 2 to make 1. Those things are constantly in motion. So trying to stay ahead of this with what you want them ready for, and then when the situation changes and all of a sudden now you got to be focused more on the high-end level of training, that requires more time, it requires more training ammunition, etc. With how we measure the readiness, because we train against one standard, obviously, to be ready. But I think the bigger issue is we take risk in terms of what on repair parts. For aviation, what I've seen over the past few years, and I am an aviator, we reduced the number of flying hours that crews were getting. As an example, the Army Guard was down to about 6.5 hours per aviator per month. Well, you can't maintain nothing more than about currency, and currency is not proficiency. We need to be at about, for the regular Army, we're down about a 10.5, and that needs to be back up to about 14.5 in my mind. But what ends up happening, these are high demand assets and they're in constant motion all the time. So there's the wear and tear on these systems, particularly with aviation. We've seen problems with that, whether it be aircraft engines or main rotor hubs, etc. It's got to be forecasted. But I'm of one that we need to get in more predictive maintenance, ability to prioritize these resources better and allocate funds better, because we have a tendency to build readiness just in time, and that's what I would tell you I've been seeing over the past few years.
Roger, sir. Guys, thank you so much. This has been incredible in terms of your insights. We are recording this for everyone else that already listened to it or people that are going to be joining later on, because there's a lot of salient points I'm sure a lot of people need to write down. I want to be mindful of the time. We're going to wrap up here in a few minutes. I know there were some folks probably on the line from Air Force that want to hear from General Frazier. I'm going to give you my contact information shortly. We can connect you with General Frazier directly. He apologized he couldn't make it. Again, the weather here in D.C. has been pretty bad, and he's trying to get to Colorado for some very important meetings. That said, I think there's a common theme that I've heard here on readiness, and that is we need to stay vigilant, right? We need vigilance across the board for training, people, material, assets, prioritization, resource allocation, the things that make this engine go. Really, at the end of the day, it's people, right, and processes. But we don't want to become mired in too much processes where we lose and get really behind the curve from a readiness perspective. So, with that, let me explain why we're here holding this webinar. And as you can see on the screen here, we've been supporting. I've been here half the amount of time, but we've been supporting the defense for about 11 years. Our first customer ever was Joint Chief of Staff, and then followed by Defense Health Agency. And what we provide at Decision Lens is an integrated way to look across your assets and all the things I just mentioned to see how the impact is against any particular item, such as readiness here. And what you're seeing on the screen is just a simplified dashboard. This is out of the box with Decision Lens, and it allows you to quickly see the overall impact. In this example, we're looking at force structure, modernization, readiness, and as you change different factors, it will show you the overall impact if you're gaining readiness or gaining ground on modernization and so forth. One of the things that we're not giving a demo. I'll give you my contact information after this, but we have the ability to give a full roll-up because a lot of times we're looking at command-wide views or portfolio of portfolios, and we provide out-of-the-box capability for leaders like yourselves to see that overall trend to make sure you're maximizing your overall dollars and optimizing your portfolio spends against readiness. So next screen, if you will. That's me, the ugly guy on the left, and my contact information's there, and you can email me anytime you want. In the middle is our website, and on the right-hand side, we have a number of videos that anyone can watch any given time. And if any of you have any follow-on questions for General Thurman or through Vice Admiral Dunaway, you can certainly send me an email, and I'll get those answers for you at a quick response. Okay, so thank you so much for attending today. We greatly appreciate it. I hope this was valuable for everyone. And most importantly, I want to thank our great leaders of this country for joining us today to have this great conversation. So General Thurman and Decoy, thank you so much. Okay. Thanks all.
Okay.
Thank you.